Good morning, everybody. I see attendees flooding in. So as you join us, welcome. Welcome everyone to Mornings with Planning, a webinar series hosted the first Wednesday of every month, where the Lexington Division of Planning discusses new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. These webinars will be held live and recorded for later viewing. My name is Lauren Weaver, GISP and Senior Planner with the Lexington Division of Planning, and I will be your moderator for today's October 7th, 2020 session. During this webinar, we will be discussing how transportation trends have been shifting and how we can respond to expand transit options for cars, bicycles, pedestrians, and mass transit. So kick back with your morning coffee or tea, and let's meet today's panelists. So we have four really great panelists today, including James Ballinger, professional engineer and professional land surveyor, currently working as a highway engineer with the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Fred Combs, Director of Planning, Technology, and Community Relations with the public transportation bus system serving Lexington called LexTran. Mike Sewell, professional engineer and Bicyclist League certified instructor, currently a principal and active transportation service line leader with Gresham Smith. And Kenzie Gleason, transportation planning administrative officer with the Lexington Division of Planning and the Lexington Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. Panelists, thank you for joining us this morning. Let's begin with a little bit of an overview of what you guys do. So we'll start with James. And James, thank you so much for filling in on short notice to bring your perspective to today's panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective on all of the different things we're going to talk about. Could you tell us a little bit about your work in the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet, and maybe a little bit about your time with the Lexington Highway District and what it's like to be an engineer in the transportation realm?
Sure. Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate the opportunity to serve on the panel today. Again, my name is James Ballinger. I'm serving currently as the State Highway Engineer for the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. And my previous experience is I worked 27 years and retired from the Highway District office in Lexington, Kentucky, though. So I'm pretty familiar with the work there in Lexington. I've worked with Kenzie on many projects, throughout the Lexington area and with the MPO. So I've got a pretty good background working on some projects there. After 27 years working at transportation, I retired and I went to work at the Kentucky Transportation Center at the University of Kentucky, doing some research and some training. And then I worked in the private sector for about 5 years. I worked for a consulting engineering firm and had a great experience there, and it gave me a new perspective. I had the good fortune to work on several projects in that role. I worked in the city of Bowling Green in downtown. I got to serve as a project manager for a streetscape job in downtown Bowling Green around Fountain Square Park. So that was a great project, though. It was a complete streets type project, though, where we were looking out to improve the pedestrian environment, as well as the David Rails Trail project in Prestonsburg, which just opened up officially just a few weeks ago. So that was a really, really good project. So had that experience, and then I've been serving for the last 2 months as the state highway engineer and having more of a statewide perspective. So hopefully today I can answer any questions, locally about some of the projects we're working on, and then provide a statewide perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it'll be really good to hear about some of those projects that are happening regionally and the background of Lexington, which has seen change even in the amount of time that I've been here. So your exposure is much more vast. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. So let's move into Fred. Fred, could you talk a little bit about your work with LexTran and how you interface with state and local governments, and maybe some aspirations upcoming for LexTran? I also understand You're a statistics professor.
I am. I teach statistics at Bluegrass Community and Technical College. That's kind of something that I just enjoy doing and had the opportunity to do and kind of love it. So I keep doing it. But yeah, on the LexTran side, I'm the director of planning here. And a couple of years ago, we went through a rebranding process in which we changed our mission. We wrote this mission statement that says, we serve people in our community with mobility solutions. that mission's very near and dear to my heart. I think my role here is to think about the future, how Lexington grows, how the community grows, and bring in the mobility solutions that are on the table and try to merge those two together. We're known for the typical city transit bus that I think, everyone sees rolling around town. That's sort of our bread and butter, but we also have paratransit service through the American Red Cross. We have a van pool service, and we provided nearly 4.5 million trips in 2019. I think that's something that we're very proud of. So my role is to think about how we are changing, how the transportation industry is changing, work closely with the MPO and local planning agencies and other agencies to make sure that transit has sort of a voice. But not only to be that forward-thinking voice, we've got 26 fixed routes here in the city, nearly 1,000 bus stops, but to take care of what we already have, to make sure that the resources that we have are being put into service the most efficient and best way that we can, to make sure our bus stops are, as accessible and useful and easy to get to and use as we can. So yeah, we've got a lot of things going on. I think it's a very exciting time to be in the transportation industry. Everything seems to be like a paradigm shift in how we think about and talk about transportation. So I'm very, very happy to be here and be a part of this discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's refreshing in a way to hear somebody who's excited about statistics. I don't think that's something that most people can relate to.
I'm on like a one-man mission to make everyone excited about statistics, but that's another panel for another morning, I think.
Well, feel free to insert statistics wherever you like, please. It'll only add to this. Okay, Mike. So you're coming from a background working with designers, problem solvers, and planners at Gresham Smith. I hope you can tell us a little bit about that and how planning and engineering lend themselves to community networks. And I understand you also have really interesting perspectives on the role of multimodal, not just from your work with Gresham Smith, but from your work as an avid cyclist.
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, thank you for having us. And Fred, I'm already all on board with statistics. I love and I'm excited now to have a statistics person on board. So yeah, a little bit about what I do in my role for Gresham Smith is I'm a nationwide resource. So I serve all of our offices to try to bring better balance to a lot of our roads. Most of my work is centered in urban settings. So where we do have a lot of other uses, micromobility, pedestrian, and access to transit, alongside with cars. I mean, we can't forget about cars as part of our roadways. Some of the more fun things I've been associated with here regionally as I was the consultant PM for the Town Branch Commons project there in Lexington. Lots of different parkways in Louisville, reimagining those, and now the Broadway corridor in Louisville as well is one of those that we're undertaking. But nationally, I sit on the board of directors for the League of American Bicyclists, which I'm really excited about because I get to be involved in nationwide advocacy, not only for funding, but also for what we should be doing just to take care of the people on our roads. Part of that culminated in me testifying in front of Congress last spring, just about the importance of making sure that all people on our corridors are safe and we have the funding allocated that we can actually do what we need to do. And then more recently, I've been really focused on user experience and the role of stress on our corridors and how we can begin to tie that to better safety fixes, perceived safety, tying it to nominal and substantive safety data sets. So that just won an award through Architect Magazine. So I've got lots of fun stuff going on, but I'm really excited to talk to you all about what's happening here in Kentucky.
That's also great. So we've got a statistics professor and a data person on board, at least one. I'm sure that we have probably everybody dipping into data a little bit. All right. Last but certainly not least, Kinsey, could you talk a little bit about your role in the MPO, which so far includes both Fayette and Jessamine County so far? And maybe talk a little bit about the multifaceted and really complex forms of funding sources and how you kind of like cobble those together. And that I know you've seen incredible changes in multimodal infrastructure in Lexington.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I've been working with the MPO for about 17 years now, and we're the transportation planning agency for both Fayette and Jessamine County, as you mentioned. And we're responsible for working with local officials and other local transportation agencies, as well as seeking input from the public to try and pull together all of those different priorities and projects and needs into a long-range transportation plan for our community, which determines how federal funding will be spent in the Lexington area. Some of that is set to us by formula. Some of that comes to us through the transportation cabinet and the state legislature. And then there are a number of grant programs that we do rely very heavily on for a lot of the bike and pedestrian infrastructure in the city. So I cut my teeth with the MPO for about 10 years as the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator, which was a very exciting job. I had the opportunity to really work on trail and bikeway and sidewalk plans for the city when we were just really starting to dig in and get serious about making improvements. So it's been very rewarding over my career to see a lot of those plans come to fruition, in part by many of the people that are here on the panel today. So yeah, I'm glad to be here and glad to talk about what's going on.
Yeah. So I work with Kinsey directly, but I keep hearing from through the grapevine of all of the great things that she's done for the bicycle and pedestrian community. So thank you for that. And again, thank you to you all. I hope I don't say that too much. I think it's really important to have these dialogues always, but especially now. So let's move into questions. We received loads of questions from registrants, which have been integrated into the questions that we'll start working through here in a moment. So to the people who shared questions, just want to thank you for your thoughts and your curiosities. We also heard from you that you are bicycling more often, working from home is more normal, walking is becoming a common pastime and transit option, and our spheres of daily existence are smaller than they were before. Audience members in attendance, feel free to submit questions using the Q&A functionality, and we'll try to ensure that that content is covered as well. Okay, so we're going to start off with a couple of questions for everybody. And to start off, again, for anybody, so just jump in as you like. How are you all getting around these days? Have you seen any shifts in your daily lifestyles as you move from some space to some space that's not your home, whatever that space might be?
Not everybody at once. I'll start then. So actually, I've seen way more people like in the neighborhood here walking and biking, and that's been increasing over the past several months, obviously because people are not going into workplaces. But it's also been interesting to see since roads are opening back up. I see a lot more cars driving a lot more aggressively, also on our neighborhood streets. And James, I'm sure, is aware. The safety stats coming out of our state and every state is concerning, but honestly, it hasn't really changed anything for me. I bike pretty much everywhere anyway. I only put like 300 miles on a car every year. So I'm kind of like normal, but for me, but it's probably atypical to most.
When you update your insurance information for car insurance, are they always like, are you sure it's only 300 miles a year?
Absolutely, yeah. It's always confusing when I go into re-up auto registrations. It's like, this doesn't make sense.
Well, Lauren, I can jump in next to, of course, and since I've been in this job 2 months, my work side is in Frankfort, but I live in a very rural part of Kentucky. I live south of Berea in Rockcastle County on our family farm. So this been it's kind of been a great benefit to me though to only have to go to Frankfort 1-2 days a week, and I'm able to work from home. So I think that, and I hope that down the road post COVID though, that we have more flexibility is what I'm the studies that I'm reading and from state government, things like that's the kind of thing that I think we're going to see. We're going to see more flexibility for our workforce. And so I'm personally benefiting from that. And as Mike said, one thing that it's a concern that we're experiencing at the State Transportation Cabinet is we are seeing more aggressive driving. We'll talk in a moment about some of the numbers. Overall passenger car trips for the same time last year are down just a bit, about right now 10%. Freight is actually up just a little bit. But we're actually seeing, and I think the reason freight's up just a little bit is I think folks are, getting their Amazon deliveries at home, things like that. More folks are ordering online, and we're seeing that just a bit. It's ticked up just a bit from the same time period last year. But one thing that's concerning, we are seeing that aggressive driving that's going on. We're the number of crashes in our work zones and the number of injuries and fatalities has actually increased in the work zones. And it's not just in a Kentucky trend though; it's nationwide right now. So that's concerning as well. So I think there's some positives that are going on, but there's also some concerns.
And I think for me, I went through those few months were strictly working at home. We were all working at home, but here the last little bit, we've kind of gotten back to the office. So I'm back in the office. I have a young child, so I'm toting her around everywhere. So I'm kind of stuck in the car. But this discussion about how traffic has changed, has impacted LexTran and our schedules is when it all sort of the bottom sort of fell out back in March, April, May. We're looking at our schedules thinking, well, this is going to wreck the bus schedules that we have because, we base our schedules at some degree around the amount of traffic that we expect. And that change in the amount of, because we had no idea how much traffic to expect as we're going into, really into the unknown. I think we were able to be very flexible and to stay on top of things and not, completely ruin the on-time performance. And as we change service around to kind of match the way that the need was really happening in real time was very interesting. And what an awesome team we have here at LexTran to make that happen so quickly. But as we're seeing now, as things start to not really return to normal, but get a little bit closer to normal, things of our old schedules are pretty close. So I think things are starting to look a little bit more like they used to, or at least as much as they can.
And I think a little bit for some local perspective, about 5% of people in Lexington before COVID were teleworking. And, they estimate that that's around at least 20%. Or actually closer to 40% right now, but maybe going forward will be up to 20% permanently. So that's at least a doubling, if not a threefold increase, which really can have a dramatic impact on peak hour traffic and congestion in our community. So it makes us kind of take a step back and question, what types of improvements maybe have we had planned that may no longer become necessary. And I think it shows the power of, individuals who are able to take a step away from the vehicle can really have a major impact on our transportation system and what it costs for us to maintain it and provide those services. So I think we're just at this point trying to predict what the future may look like, but also taking a step back and seeing how things unfold.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Some of those things that you guys just shared were surprising to me. I hadn't realized that the roads were becoming more dangerous. It's really interesting, especially as multimodal transportation options are becoming more common. People are biking, people are walking. We see it. So it's discouraging, I guess, to hear that things are also becoming more dangerous. There's a question we'll get to here in a bit about how we help educate people on how to keep everybody safe that I think will be really even more important than I had realized before. I also, so on the point of teleworking, I saw a study recently, and I can't remember the source, unfortunately, but it was surveying people on their preferences for teleworking or office work. And it showed that about 30% preferred to telework completely. About 30%, interestingly, it was pretty close to the same. There were some, maybe like 6 percentages difference. Preferred to be in the office completely. And then the remaining preferred some type of combination. So I thought that was really, really revealing in certain ways. So we'll see what changes come as a result of these times. All right. So we've talked a little bit about some transportation trends that we're seeing. This next question I think would be really excellent for James, but of course, guys, feel free to weigh in if you have something to say on any of these questions. I'm trying to get it to a person to start it off, but don't let that stop it if you have something you really, really want to contribute. So James, have you seen any major transportation projects in the Commonwealth right now that you think will impact Lexington?
Sure. Thank you, Lauren. And there are three that I'd like to touch on today, though, that are in the Lexington area that the Transportation Cabinet's currently working on. One is on Liberty Road. I think a lot of folks in Lexington are familiar with that corridor. It goes from like Liberty Elementary School into New Circle Road, and when I worked in the private industry, my office was on Fortune Drive, which was just off Liberty. So I got to experience the number of pedestrians that use the corridor, though. So it was really, really eye-opening for me to see the number of folks out there. And there actually, there's no sidewalk, but there's actually, I call it a cow path worn parallel to the roadway. You know, it's just, there's just that many folks that are out walking, usually using that corridor. So the Transportation Cabinet there in Lexington, they're developing a project currently, though, that'll include sidewalks as well as a shared use path along that corridor. So I think that's an important project. And a couple of projects I'd like to focus on just for a moment is it's the New Circle Road projects. And I realize, you know, that the panel today is talking about complete streets and other modes of transportation. But we're working on a New Circle Road to make some improvements, some mobility improvements from Boardwalk around to Georgetown and then from Georgetown to Leestown. But the point of talking about those projects, though, it's that we're going to be improving the interchanges at Leestown and Georgetown Road. And this came up back a few years ago when we were working on Harrodsburg Road, though, that New Circle Road has historically served as a real barrier, though, for pedestrians and folks riding bikes, you know, to go from inside to outside New Circle Road. And as we have grown, though, there's a lot of neighborhoods and a lot of, you know, reasons that folks want to walk and ride their bikes, you know, from inside to outside. Someone called it one time, it almost serves as like an urban river. It's a real barrier, though. And so with those projects, though, there's going to be an incorporation of bike and ped facilities, though, with those projects, though, and so that it provides that opportunity, though, for movement, you know, for pedestrians to go through those interchanges. And if that's a pretty big deal, you know, and that's something that's been a shift that's been occurring over the last several years, though, that's been a shift in how that the transportation engineers develop our projects, though, to consider the other modes of transportation. It started back a long time ago, but that's just some examples. I know we don't want to talk too specific about all the projects because if there's specific questions, though, you guys can reach out to me. Be happy to answer any specific questions about that. But I guess the point is that with all of our projects, though, throughout, you know, Lexington, all of Kentucky, though, is that the other modes are considered, and we're much more open, definitely, than we were when I first started in transportation, though, to incorporating those, and worked with Kenzie on a lot of these projects all along the way. So those are great projects.
And Lauren, I'd actually like to chime in about the Liberty Road project.
Please.
That's a good example of a partnership that's going to result in a really interesting trail project that extends beyond Liberty Road. I mean, I think everyone's familiar with the Legacy Trail to the north and the Town Branch Trail to the west that's coming, that'll come from, you know, the outer parts of the city into downtown. Well, we're actually working on basically a similar trail system to the east. We call it the Brighton Rail Trail. But we already have 4 miles of trail that's been constructed. It starts at the outer reaches of the city at Deer Haven Lane. It travels under I-75, which is another barrier, as James mentioned. We're building a bridge over Man o' War currently that connects into the trail system at Liberty Park there near the school, where the Transportation Cabinet will be picking up their project from Liberty Elementary down to New Circle Road. Well, because the MPO knows that project is coming and that we'll have a good trail facility, we've already begun to program a project from New Circle on into town to Winchester Road so that we can provide a continuous facility all the way to there. And then we'll just have a short distance we need to get down Winchester Road to get us all the way to 3rd Street, where the major trailhead for Town Branch Trail and the Legacy Trail all come together. So we have some exciting plans in place. Can't see them yet on the ground, but they're coming for the Liberty Road projects.
Yeah, that's really great. It's cool to see how Lexington is continuing to grow and residential neighborhoods are constructed and upgraded. And it seems like what we're seeing is that as that becomes more common, people also want that multimodal infrastructure. It's not just the traffic increase from vehicles, but it's also the desire to walk, demonstrated by cow paths. You have to walk a lot to wear a cow path into the grass. So it's really great to hear that we're trying to meet those needs of the community. I'm curious, can you talk a little bit more about how you approach retrofitting multimodal infrastructure and projects to improve networks? For anybody.
I can jump in real briefly. I know Mike has probably got some really good comments. He's worked on several of these type projects as well, though. Around the central Kentucky area, though, as when I was working for the Transportation Cabinet, I think I lost count at about 12 of the road diet type projects that we'd worked on around central Kentucky. And we had examples in I guess starting out with one of the first projects that was implemented was on Euclid Avenue, Avenue of Champions in Lexington. That project many years ago, what has it been, 20 or so years ago, kind of modeled the way for how we could implement these projects. And then things like in downtown Richmond, we were able to implement a road diet to go from an old 4-lane side-by-side roadway to a 3-lane with turn lanes. It allowed for better, shorter crossing distances for pedestrians. Georgetown, Versailles, we've implemented roadway diets there, and just taken the existing space that we have from curb to curb, basically, and rethinking how that space could be allocated and used for all the modes of transportation, though, for considering pedestrians and bikes, and make it a safer environment for the folks using the roadways. We built bypasses around most of these towns, and some instances 2 bypasses and an interstate. And so it's time to kind of, the way we look at it, to rethink how those spaces are used. And so we've been encouraging that. We're working on one just recently in Frankfort, city of Frankfort, that was implemented on US 60. And we're working on plans. I actually was talking about it this morning to extend it on into downtown Frankfort. So these are just it's become part of our, I guess, how we approach our projects. So it's not only on new infrastructure, but it's on existing projects as well to rethink it and implement complete street practices. So thank you.
Certainly, I use that Euclid bike lane all the time, and I'm quite grateful for it, especially in it's a pretty small road, really. So having a lane that is like just for bicycles, I think helps move things more quickly too. It's not like you can be passed readily if you were sharing the same lane. Mike, I'd love to hear about your work with Complete Streets and how you approach retrofitting things that are already in place. You're working with barriers. How do you use those barriers, maybe even to your benefit?
Sure. Well, and I think James hit the nail on the head. I think all of us are challenged with doing more with less space, or the same amount of space, and definitely less dollars. That's another one of those trends that we didn't get to talk about, is the tax base. The net revenue that people have to spend on facilities is decreasing. And that's just a logical thing, that the fallout, because people are not spending as much money and they're not out using their cars and generating gas tax. So right sizing our roads is the reality. I mean, we have to take, you can't look at historic things that we've had to do as engineers and the tables that we use to justify decisions. It just doesn't work anymore. We have to approach these things a little bit more flexibly. Flexibility in design is a requirement, as all of us engineers, and James is shaking his head. Yes, it's in the forward of all of our manuals. We have to approach these things flexibly. So understanding, I think, what parameters we have to float, and then I think also is the recognition that, and this has been mentioned too, with cow paths, we call them desire lines now. I think some people get offended if we call them cow paths.
So I like that better.
That's fine. We can call them cow paths. We're in Kentucky, it's fine. But the desire lines, I mean, that really starts to point to where there are barriers in the system. And I think those should be prioritized for the retrofits. And the other thing about, and I believe multiple people, Kenzie and James mentioned this, is barriers in our system, is we have to understand too that not everyone has access to a car. Not even everyone has access to a bus pass or a bike. And so understanding that there are social type of barriers, and they just want to get to the same places we want to get to. They want to get from their house to a specific destination. and finding out what makes that network work for everyone. And then the give and take happens on specific projects inside the right of way. I think we just have to be open to that current.
And I think the one more point on the desire path, especially Liberty Road, is we know that a lot of that is driven by transit demand. In that corridor specifically, we've studied the ridership trends there. We know that a lot of that is driven by people trying to access transit stops that are on Fortune Drive. So when we talk about retrofitting, that's where the transit role comes into play. We are so interlocked with pedestrian infrastructure to make sure that people can get the first and last mile connection, can get the bus stop safely and access the bus safely, but then also on the right of way to make sure that there's space for a bus to safely, pull to the curb, board the lot, get back into traffic and move, without interrupting traffic as much as, keeping that to a minimum. So as James said, this new thought of complete street elements in the projects, I've seen it here and it is working. I think, I think we'd all agree we've got more to do, but Lexington is doing a great job of thinking about multimodal design and multimodal practices in new roads and in retrofits.
Yeah,
Just
that's
had one
Go ahead,
final
Paul.
thought, Lauren. Speaking of transit and pedestrian usage, so we updated our bicycle and pedestrian master plan just a couple of years ago. And of course, we have an inventory of all the locations throughout the city where we need better bike and pedestrian infrastructure. And so you have to prioritize that. You can't do everything. So you have to decide where to start. And we really placed a heavy emphasis on transit routes being one of our primary priorities for getting better pedestrian facilities in and on the ground. And I can say that, of all the funding that comes to the MPO area by formula that's dedicated to our area where we have the most decision-making power over that, most of the projects that we select for that funding are either even standalone bike and pedestrian projects. They're driven primarily for the need for a sidewalk or whatnot, or they're roadway projects like Liberty Road inside New Circle, where we're not really looking at adding capacity there. We're really looking at bringing the street up to modern day standards. So, when we are working on major roadway projects, a lot of the driver is the complete streets aspect of that, as opposed to they're not being driven by a need for capacity. For cars, that is, yeah.
Yeah, capacity is a tricky thing, right? Because you can shift capacity. I've seen some interesting images where it shows how much space a person on foot takes up, and then how much space a person on a bike takes up, and then how much space a person on a bus and in an individual car take up. And that's really interesting when you start thinking about capacity, because if you can fit more people into a space and still have a space 6 or more feet apart right now, you can get a lot more people in. You can increase that capacity without necessarily having to expand the road. You can get creative with the complete streets. So this, where we're at right now, leads really well into a lot of great questions that we had come in from the audience. One of those to start off is more about pedestrian infrastructure. So as we see these desire lines, which is a much better term, showing up in places, and we see areas growing and developing and populations increasing, how can a community like Lexington and others as well seek to improve its pedestrian infrastructure? Maybe you guys have some practical tips, whether it's from a citizen advocacy or a push in the government, partnerships of organizations, combinations of funding. There are so many components there. It's really overwhelming to think about it. Do you guys have any tips? And I think this might be a good one for Mike and Kinsey, but I think everybody's got expertise on this.
And honestly, if it's specific to Lexington, in many ways, I'm very jealous of how Lexington handles their multimodal facilities. Lexington's footprint is fairly small. I mean, you can walk from one end to the other of the entire city in an hour. And it's honestly got a pretty good, interconnected network of pedestrian facilities. And I think where you see the breakdowns is between friction of other uses or these critical gaps that happen in the network. The friction between other users is just making sure that everyone understands the importance of providing access for everyone. And I think, honestly, that comes through just education or trying to tempt folks that are not aware of the importance of designing for all users to entice them to get out of their car and potentially walk to a destination, which Lexington is fantastic for that. I typically, if I come to Lexington, I'll stay downtown and I will get my bike out and walk and bike to everywhere that I need to go to. And it's set up really well. Now, improving the pedestrian infrastructure, it's providing more adequate facilities. You do have a lot of instances, especially you get into the neighborhoods at North Lime and areas like that, where there are very narrow, facilities where they're not ADA compliant. So there are obviously things you can do to retrofit those specific areas to make sure that it's more accommodating to all users. But I'm jealous. Me in Louisville, I'm pretty upset that you guys tend to respond very fast to these types of requests versus a larger city. You're just more nimble.
Well, Mike, it's funny to me that you say that. So I was actually in Louisville for 5-6 years before I came to Lexington. And I remember, so I didn't have a car when I lived in Louisville. Then I moved to Lexington and I realized I needed to buy a car. But that was in 2012. And the improvements to the infrastructure that I've seen since that time, I guess in the last 8 years, time flies, right, have been incredible, to the point where, like, I think that if I wanted to sell my car at this point, I could, and I could still get around even better than I did during my time in Louisville. I love Louisville. I'm not knocking Louisville at all. But it's just amazing to see that. Kinsey or anybody, would you like to weigh in on that one?
Well, I guess just what we find is in our urban core, where we may have some sidewalks that are maybe not as generous as we would hope, or in some instances, I think one of our attendees noted the issue of obstacles being in those sidewalks as well. You see that more in the more urban parts of the community. And then we kind of move through a period in time during which we weren't building sidewalks in neighborhoods or along corridors, and then to modern day where our standards currently do require sidewalks again as a basic infrastructure for any kind of development. So we have some improvements that we need to make in the downtown areas. I think this attendee asked, is there a method or a plan for doing that? And, while we do have an inventory of where we do have sidewalks and where we don't necessarily have an inventory of where we might have a barrier within the sidewalk. So I think the best approach to that is, if there is a particular location that is problematic for a user, for them to make us aware of it. You can use the 311 line to do that. They're very responsive in getting those routed to the appropriate people. And then we can kind of coordinate identifying what is the barrier. Is it a utility pole? Whom is it owned by? Can we reach out to that utility company to see if they can move it because someone has identified it as a specific problem for them accessing that facility. In terms of new development, we recently just updated our subdivision regulations to require much wider sidewalks. That's in part to better align with best practices particularly for Americans with Disabilities standards. But we now require 5-foot sidewalks on just local streets in our new developments, and 6 and up to 8-foot sidewalks where we have more substantial, busier corridors. So we're trying to make sure that we get it right from the beginning now in new development, and then try to retrofit, the areas where maybe we weren't so focused on pedestrian activity during those decades. I see you there, Mike.
Thank you.
Do you have something to add?
Well, yeah, you touched on this, and then Dixie Moore, one of my favorite peoples of all time, has put in a question in chat about some of these older neighborhood streets. Hey, Dixie, how are you? If you all didn't know, Dixie is the one that championed the 3-foot passing law for Kentucky, so we love her. But a lot of these older communities or older sections of Lexington, they have really old historic streets that are already very narrow. And I think the answer, one of the solutions that we can wrap around that is there's going to be major streets where lots of people kind of gravitate towards, and that's just fine. Cars will gravitate towards certain streets. But these other ones where it's more residential in nature, the traffic should be calmed where people can feel comfortable. Even if I'm on a bike and sharing the lane, that should be fine. And I should feel pretty confident, even if I've got a family in tow or, my mom is out there with me. And that goes back to other decisions we make as engineers to make sure that it's passively and actively a calm street. Now, that doesn't necessarily work on those major thoroughfares, but there's still, like Kenzie's mentioning, there's still opportunities. And you mentioned Euclid. Euclid's another great example of putting in infrastructure that still works, even though you're sharing the space with maybe some uncomfortable other users. So I just wanted to touch on that because I saw Dixie's comment, and then Kenzie was pointing to other things that related to it.
I've never met Dixie, but Dixie, you have so much of my respect. So thank you for your work in the bicycle community. It takes a huge amount of advocacy and persistence to get something like that passed, but it means that we're a lot safer on the road as cyclists, and that makes a big difference.
Right. Do you mind if I weigh in just a second on that
Sure,
particular issue? It's something I was thinking about, and I was thinking about. There's 3 P's that I like to think about as we're related to that. It's our policies, it's our planning, and our projects. And we talked quite a bit about our, some of our projects that we've been working on across the state and in Kentucky, though. And there's quite a few policies out there. I was preparing for thinking about the discussion today and looking around last night. We've got several policies from the federal and state and local policies. Kenzie's talked about some of those locally. But I think one thing I'd like to focus on, it's that planning piece of it, though, and it's some of the educational component. I think that's so very important to this. And I think that's one reason. I know you all talked about kind of what's going on in Lexington and the changes that's occurred over the last 7 or 8, 10 years. And a lot of that work started back 20 years or so ago with the coordination and planning work that was handled through the MPO. I've got to give those guys a great deal of credit. And one kind of an interesting thing that happened several years ago is, I'm not sure who brought Mr. Fenton to town, but Mark Fenton came to Lexington, though. It might have been the MPO, and we had some training, and he did a walkability study or walkability effort there, where we walked from along Versailles Road to downtown Lexington, though, and we talked about those barriers and those impediments to pedestrian travel. And it was part of that educational effort, though, that kind of planted those seeds that got us talking to each other, that started the conversation between the area development districts and the MPO, and we started planning that and incorporating that in development of our projects. So, and sometimes these things take 5, 10, even, a Newtown Pike extension took 50 years to develop, but today we have much improved, modal opportunities with those projects. So, but it has to start on the front end with the education and with the planning efforts and people talking to each other, though, and incorporating these things. And it just takes time. It really does. And I'll give the MPO all the credit in the world, though. It wasn't anything. The reason I call him CalPass, I'm a cattle farmer from Rockcastle County, though. These guys, I'll give them all the credit in the world, though, for helping me to understand the importance of this in our urban areas, though. So absolutely.
Yeah, James, that really leads in very well to the next questions I actually have tagged, which are about safety and education. So we can passively and actively retrofit existing structure or create structure as we move into new development that makes a huge difference in how safe people feel and the options that they're willing to pursue. But that's not realistic everywhere. There are always going to be those places that people need to be able to feel safe cycling without safe infrastructure, or need to feel safe walking or getting around on a mobility device without a perfect infrastructural setup. So how do we educate one another on how to share space, how to coexist and keep each other safe and well, whether that's wearing helmets, whether that's discussing how we can share the road more effectively. I'm sure, Mike, you have great things to say on that from the League of American Cyclists. And I'm sure Fred has great things to say on that about pedestrian infrastructure and how that combines with transit infrastructure. I'm sure you all have great things to say on this. So can you speak a little bit about education and sharing space and keeping each other safe?
So one of the most eye-opening experiences before I got into planning was to sit in a wheelchair, get on the bus, get off a wheelchair, get off the bus, go have lunch, get back on the bus and go back to campus. I mean, I was in grad school, 15 years ago or however long ago that was. that experience was so eye-opening of how hard it was, and something that we owe to everyone to have access to mobility to get around, to go to lunch. I mean, that's something that we might take for granted. After I had that experience, it still obviously has left an impression on me. And I've challenged other people to do it in my career as well. If you think what we do is difficult, try it from this perspective, and then, tell me how difficult that is, and how much emphasis we should be putting into our infrastructure and to make it open and accessible to everyone. So to have someone, I think perspective is the most important part of this education piece, to have people to give it a shot. If you're not thinking of it from the right perspectives, there's so much growth and learning that can be done from something as simple as that.
Yeah, I've even done that just on my bike, like pretended to be in a mobility device, like a wheelchair, and seen where I can go. And on my bike, I can hop curbs on it. You can't do that otherwise. But you can do that with even just a bicycle. I would heavily encourage everybody to take some time and try that out.
Yeah. Well, and I can tack on too, because I think Fred nails it. It is the ability to walk another mile or roll in someone else's shoes. And I think the role of empathy in what we have to do as designers has been unfortunately lost. And I think there's lots of things societally and politically going on that will take a back burner. And I think that's doing ourselves and our professions a disservice. I think making sure at its core, we signed up, in the engineers on the call, we took an oath that we would be looking out for the public's best well-being, period. The health and wealth or the health and safety of other folks. And so to do that and do that effectively, we have to be empathetic. We have to understand what other users are going through. And it's not just any one group. It's not just, cars going 50 miles an hour through Vine Street in downtown Lexington. That is not being empathetic. And if we allow that to occur, we're not doing our jobs. So I like the idea that Fred throws out, is just really put yourself in those shoes and see what it's like. I know here in Louisville, we've done similar studies where we put a GoPro on a wheelchair and a GoPro on, a bike and then a pedestrian, and time the different routes that people have to take to be able to navigate between two spots. And it's pretty stark, the comparisons, and the weird hoops that people have to jump through just to get to destinations due to inadequate facilities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd be interested to see more of that study and what was taken away. I've definitely found that cars and bicyclists can be pretty compatible, in especially like the short, more local trips like are so common in Lexington. Gosh, guys, we have so many questions to get through. We're definitely not going to get through them all. So I'm going to try and pick the ones that we can hit today. But again, I want to encourage the audience, if you have any questions after this, whether they're general or on a specific project, know that these folks are available and trying to make our community really great, even greater than it is even. So let's see. Let's move into this question. There are a couple questions about mass transit. And I'm going to kind of group a couple together here. I think this would be good for James perhaps, and Fred, and of course anybody else. So what are some trends that we're seeing in public transit, maybe even around the country or regionally? And how do you break the chicken egg conundrum? How do we get more riders without more buses and more buses without more riders? How do you balance that and create that movement to tip the balance into more usage?
I'll take those sort of in reverse order. First, the chicken and the egg conundrum. We actually have added some service on Nicholasville Road, and it worked. We saw an increase in ridership that kind of goes against the national trend. We're very proud of that. And I think really it comes down to funding. We know that there are corridors and areas and routes in the city that could use more service. If funding were to be available, we would make that happen. And as Mike talked about earlier on in the panel discussion, the purchasing power that we have is decreasing every single year. And, we're trying to do the best we can with what we have. But really the answer to that question always comes back around to funding. So then the previous question about the major trends, I think one of the trends that I keep keep thinking about and seeing is this idea of frictionless travel, where as a person wants to move about the city, you can do that without really even thinking about it, without the commute or the trip being a pain, so to speak. So to move about without friction means that you have maybe one ticket for multiple modes, or the different modes are integrated, and that is coming about through technology called mobility as a service. So that's rethinking how people interact with transportation, not just transit, but transportation comprehensively. We recently won a grant award called Accelerating Innovative Mobility, where we're going to do a pilot study on University of Kentucky campus that gets at this mobility as a service platform on 2 different levels. And the first of that is providing information to the riders to know where all the vehicles are, LexTran and beyond, and allows them to choose the trip based on vehicle capacities and other things, because we are in, the pandemic, and we need to practice social distancing and other things. That information to the customer or the rider is so very important. But as we have people indicating that they need a trip or that they need transportation, it also sends a message back to our dispatch office to allow us to manage capacity, so we can send out additional supply if necessary and if needed. So I think that frictionless travel piece is certainly a trend around in the industry, and this pilot study we're going to be doing over the next year is how that's manifesting itself locally.
That's neat. So creating better infrastructure using technology and like smart approaches to capacity to keep people moving and safe. All right. Would anybody else like to weigh in on that one? There are plenty of questions. Don't feel pressured. Okay, so we're in our last bit here. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple more. Okay, when road networks have patterns of continuity and connectivity, flow is smoother. I think that might get to your frictionless traffic to a certain extent. And access to resources for all community members is greatly increased. Can you share ways and patterns by which connectivity of multimodal networks is enabled? Fred just talked about some of those ways of trying to connect the pieces. What other things have you guys seen effective in connectivity of multimodal networks? We've got maybe Kinsey, Mike, James tagged on this one.
Yeah,
I think
sorry.
Mike was trying, he was just muted.
I was just talking to myself. It happens a lot, Kinsey. No,
okay,
it's actually it's really related to what Fred was talking about. And unfortunately, I'm going to use a reference from 100 years ago. A landscape architect, Frederick Law Olmsted, kind of had it right. And it's taken a long time for us engineers to actually get caught up. But people want basic things. They want intuitive facilities, they want to be comfortable, and they want to be safe. And the same should apply today. So talking to the continuity and the patterns, we're seeing a really good example on our Town Branch Commons project in downtown Lexington, where there are specific patterns associated with different modes of transportation. It makes intuitive sense as you start to approach a mixing zone based on the finishes that we're putting into the physical, the top layer of riding surface. So things like that just make it so much easier to get from one point to another, because it just makes logical sense. And then the other things we've been talking about, rolling up just safer separation of modes, going back to frictionless travel, all these modes want the same thing. We want to be able to share the same space with a scooter and not get ran over, right? But that scooter also wants to get to a certain destination. So making sure that we've got enough space to accommodate all those things, making sure that it just makes sense. And wayfinding and signage is another huge important part that I would throw out. If we want to get to specific neighborhoods, wayfinding, especially if you're a visitor and I want to get to North Lime Donuts, give me a sign that gets me over to, the bike shop in North Lime Donuts from downtown. And it just starts to make sense. And then if you have the infrastructure to support that connection, then it works.
And I just say, Lexington's not the first city to attempt to build a connected network. We're just a little further behind some of the other cities throughout the country that have been at this a bit longer than us. And I remember I used to always say, oh, well, why do we have that bike lane? I never see any bikes in that bike lane. I don't even see anybody using that trail out there. It's like, well, you don't see a whole lot of cars on dead end streets either, because there's nowhere to go just yet. You have to have some faith that once the system is connected, if you build it, they do in fact come. And I don't see any reason why Lexington would be any different from any other city that have seen their bike and walk rates, just exponentially grow in relationship to how connected those networks are. So we're getting there. We have a long way to go, but we're trying to push the ball in that direction for sure.
I'll agree completely, Kenzie. And Fred was talking about the connectivity with the transit, things like that. And sometimes it's as small as making sure that the sidewalk connects to the bus stop somewhere. It's the big things that we do. It's the planning things we've talked about, but it's even the little things that we can do to make sure that system works. Over the years, though, there's been many examples that we've noticed, though, where maybe it's not just the last few hundred feet or connectivity, it's just a few feet to provide a sidewalk somewhere, or a covered bus stop somewhere to make it more available for the folks that are using the transit. So it's everything, I guess. It's the big planning piece, it's education, but it's also the small decisions that we need to work together and communicate and collaborate between all the agencies, between the public, our stakeholders. I know that's so very important, though, to hear from the stakeholders too, about what needs they have in their communities. So I think it takes all of it and everyone working together.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, we are certainly better together than we are separate. As a general rule across the board, at least in my worldview. So we're already at the end. There are so many questions that we didn't get to. It's been a really great hour. It's gone really, really fast. I'm going to wrap up with a question that's for each of you, and then we'll kind of conclude it and close out today's session. So that question is, how might our transportation systems, from complete streets to funding considerations, play a role in maintaining sustainable growth and alleviating social issues of health and health disparity in Lexington?
I think that's a tough one, but I think it is building place. If we can consider transportation and land use surrounding it to build places and not just try to get as many people in and out as fast as we can.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and for the sustainable growth, if you look at white papers produced, I always point to these because I think they're fantastic, but it's out of the Epley Institute from the Indiana University. When you do multimodal well, cities benefit, period. Businesses benefit. There's lots of technical resources out there that show that it's the right decision to do, not only to keep people safer, to provide access, but also just the health and viability financially of local businesses and cities overall. So I just tack that on. Plus, multimodal users usually don't tear up infrastructure, so it's usually,
you don't tear up on your bike?
I do not. No, it's pretty good investment for me.
Fred, Kenzie?
Was multitasking. I was typing an answer in the chat box and my dog was also whining at me like he really needs to go out to that. So I kind of missed the first part of the question. So I'm going to let it sit right there. With Mike seems like he had a pretty good closer. I agree.
Working in the times with all of the different distractions and benefits as well. Yeah. Okay. Fred, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I think what I said earlier, it's placemaking. It is yeah. Thinking about what we can do to build neighborhoods and build places that people want to go to and participate in.
I think now I'm the one multitasking. Sorry about that. Okay. Would anybody like to add anything before we wrap up?
I would before we wrap up. I think we all need to give a virtual round of applause to Lauren for being a great moderator for this. So thank you for that.
You guys make it easy.
And then I was trying to respond to some questions in the chat box, but I would just offer, please, anyone, I'm kind of the local contact here for at least the roadway, bike, and pedestrian. Of course, Fred is here from Lextran, but if there's anything that we weren't able to touch on, feel free to email me. I included that in some of the response boxes, my email address, and we'll definitely get back to you.
Great. Okay, well, we had a really great conversation yet again today. We heard good things and concerning things, like roads are potentially becoming more dangerous right now with people speeding up. We learned about some great projects that are happening and Liberty Road and New Circle and multimodal projects that are becoming more common in general, which is great for our society. Talked about how we can improve road allocation from curb to curb to cram as much capacity for many modes of transit in as possible. And we talked about the 3 Ps from James, which I thought was a really cool way of thinking about it: policy, planning, and projects. Talked about mobility as a service and some current things that are going on with that to create frictionless networks, and how we can encourage sustainable growth and alleviate health disparities with multimodal infrastructure that has numerous benefits. I'd like to express gratitude to our panelists, James, Fred, Mike, and Kenzie. Our coordinator for this webinar was Chris Woodall, and he did a really helpful job consolidating questions and making sure everything was running smoothly as we moved into it. Thank you to Sam Castro for the live Q&A support. We've got a line of communication going over on this screen and have been able to integrate questions from the audience thanks to her work there. And technical support, Stephanie Cunningham for setting up this Zoom meeting and getting everything running. And of course, to our audience, without you here, the conversation wouldn't really have as much of a purpose. I'm sure we in this panel could sit and talk for hours, days, weeks about these topics, but it's really the community that makes those discussions matter. So with that, we'll close out. The Morning with Planning's webinar series will continue to discuss new ways to reconnect, reimagine, and respond in a new reality. And we want to hear from you. What topics should we discuss as we move Lexington forward together? You can email us at imagine@lexingtonky.gov to let us know. We'll be back on the first Wednesday of next month, November 4th, where we will be discussing public engagement, which is a very important topic. For more information on future sessions, to access the recording from this webinar, and to learn more about planning in Lexington, visit imaginelexington.com or lexingtonky.gov/planning, and follow us on our social media networks. Thank you for spending your morning with us. You can't see, but I'm toasting you with my cup of tea, and we'll see you next time.